We are officially entering week 12 of fantasy football, and you guys need to rack up W's. You need to build momentum. You need to secure your playoff spots, and I got you covered with my top 36 wide receivers in the tier list format I bring you guys every week. Going through my wide receiver 1s, my wide receiver 2s, my wide receiver 3s, and my favorite flex plays entering week 12 of fantasy football. Like I said, it is crunch time. It is win or go home at this stage, and making these right wide receiver calls could mean the difference between winning your matchup or being knocked out of the playoffs in 7th or worse. But before we get into the official tier list, we usually go through the will they play tier. As you'll see, guys like Mike Evans, Malik Neighbors, we do expect to play in this game based off recent reports, so there are no true questionables entering this slate. The one piece of information, though, is that we do know Devontae Smith is out with his hamstring injury. If you have Devontae Smith, unfortunately, he will not be playing in this game. But let's waste no more time. Let's go straight to the top 12, starting with my wide receiver 1 on the slate. And we've gone a long way, but I do have Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions here. 29 implied Lions points is the main reason why I have him here. And I'll give Amon-Ra his flowers. I mean, he had his blow-up spot last week, over 35 PPR points, really big target magnet in this Detroit offense. Again, I do have a little bit of concern on a week-to-week basis because of how little Detroit is throwing the football, but we know Amon-Ra St. Brown, very strong peripherals, operating that slot position for this Ben Johnson offense will yield extreme upside given how strong it projects. I mean, we look at this Lions offense being just a tier above any other offense in the NFL as currently constructed, and Amon-Ra St. Brown is the catalyst in that passing game. Like I said, it is a little bit of a concern because they are throwing the ball 9 times less per game. But with how strong this offense projects, I don't think it's a big enough concern to knock Amon-Ra St. Brown much lower than number 1. If you want to argue between him, between Nico Collins, who we'll talk about, between Justin Jefferson, that's fine. But Amon-Ra has the clearest matchup of all those 3, and Amon-Ra St. Brown is coming off a big game. So I trust him. Again, I don't have to explain too much further. We're literally talking about some of the biggest set and forget it pieces in fantasy, but wanted to give some more context to Amon-Ra St. Brown, considering I've had him lower in these last couple of weeks. But moving on to number 2, we have Nico Collins. And as you'll know, I mean, although I've been, lower on Amon-Ra St. Brown these last couple of weeks, at no point in this year have I been low on Nico Collins. You guys know my thoughts. Former Michigan alum himself, going to play the Tennessee Titans at home this week. And he's currently a top 4 wide receiver in points per game at 19.4. And when you isolate out the games he failed to record at least 50% of the snaps, he's averaging 22.8 PPR points per game. That is 0.1 point per game less than Jamar Chase, the current wide receiver 1. So that paints a picture just to how strong a season Nico Collins has had. He's an elite alpha. He is the number 1 on this Texans offense. And we saw it return to form this past week. 34 points scored against the Dallas Cowboys, and he had a 77-yard touchdown call back. Despite only playing 47% of the snaps on Monday Night Football, we saw Nico Collins command 7 targets, and like I said, had not only that touchdown call back, another big, 15, 20-plus yard completion call back, showing that Nico Collins, despite it not all showing up in the box score, him returning at full strength last week. I think there's a real possibility that down the stretch, Nico Collins is the piece you need in fantasy football. And although Tennessee is very good against wide receivers, we know that if this Texans offense can just click, can just figure it out down the stretch, we know CJ Stroud's a top-end quarterback. We know this offense projects as a top 5 to 10 unit. And we know Nico Collins is one of the best 5 wide receivers on planet Earth right now. But moving on to my wide receiver 3, we have Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, 21.5 implied Vikings points this week, going up to play the Chicago Bears on the road. He's the wide receiver 3 this year, 18.1 PPR points per game, and now a big-time pivotal matchup against Chicago. And while the weekly ceiling hasn't quite been there for Jefferson this year, he has been running extremely cold on touchdowns in the last month, and I do think that corrects itself. In that same time frame, Sam Darnold has thrown 7 touchdowns, none of them going to Justin Jefferson. However, he's been getting 8-plus targets in every game since week 3. However, even without the touchdowns, we know he's been getting 8-plus targets in every game since week 3. So if he does cross the line, maybe we finally see that ceiling week for Jefferson. And I'll just group wide receivers 4 to 6 together because they obviously all play in that same game environment on Sunday Night Football. Eagles taking on the Rams in LA. We start off with my wide receiver 4 with A.J. Brown. Offensive passing volume has really been the issue for A.J. Brown as of late. Since the Eagles bye week, Hurts has been averaging less than 22 pass attempts per game. And as we've seen, the Eagles' run game has gotten going. In their last 5 games, the Eagles have rushed for 13 rushing touchdowns. So with A.J. Brown, I think the big games are going to be coming. I think the big plays are going to be coming. I mean, the Eagles are just decimating people on the ground right now, getting into very advantageous game scripts. And I really do think this is going to be a high-scoring affair with the Rams on the other end. I'll talk about how the Rams offense projects in a second because I do think the Eagles defense is a very strong one. But with how the Rams are operating, I really do think this is a shootout type of environment with no Devontae Smith on on the field, I think it's a lock that A.J. Brown's going to command 30+% of the targets. And if the Eagles are just not simply running the ball at will, maybe we finally see some positive regression in the passing game. And on the flip side for the Rams wide receivers, like I mentioned, it is a very tough matchup. The Eagles, I will give their flowers, have been an extremely good pass defense, specifically in the secondary as of late. I mean, with how Cooper DeJean has been playing, with how Quinyon Mitchell has been playing, we're really seeing that Eagles defense take the next step. However, on the flip side, I mean, we know McVay's a genius. We know this Rams offense is very consolidated down to these top 2 targets. And with how they have been playing, I think they merit high-end wide receiver 1 status. This, like I said, should be a shootout environment. 49 implied over-under, which is 3rd highest on the slate. So really, I just want players a part of this game environment. I understand the defenses on the other end have their own strengths, but I think this is going to be an offensive show. And as we see by the Vegas line, Vegas also expects that. Wide receiver 7 for me this week is Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. 26.5 implied Dolphins points at home hosting the New England Patriots this week. And with Tyreek Hill, he did have doubters, with that wrist injury, a lot of, pessimism around Tyreek Hill, around the industry. But he looked good this past week. 8 targets, 7 receptions, 61 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. And Tua has been playing some great football since he came back from the concussions. We know what Tyreek represents. I mean, he is arguably one of the top 4 overall wide receiver talents, maybe even arguably wide receiver 1 in the league when he's at full go. I feel like the wrist injury has really skewed people's perceptions of him, because if Tyreek Hill is not inhibited by that injury like he showed this past week, he still has high-end wide receiver 1 level upside. It's risky. I understand the risk is a concern, but with Tyreek Hill and Tua Tagovailoa playing at their full ceiling, I really do think Tyreek Hill can win fantasy leagues down the stretch. There is Christian Gonzalez on the other side, but I trust Mike McDaniel to get Tyreek Hill into the right alignment, maybe some cheat motion, maybe some slot usage to get away from Christian Gonzalez, because as we know with the New England defense, outside of Christian Gonzalez, they cannot cover a fly. Wide receiver 8 is CeeDee Lamb of my Dallas Cowboys. Only 17.25 implied Cowboys points really hurts his projection. However, we do have a 2-game sample size of him with Cooper Rush now, and while we saw what the floor looks like in the first week against Philadelphia, we did see that in a more positive matchup, because like I said, Philadelphia's defense has been very good against the pass. In a more positive matchup against Houston, CeeDee Lamb went out there, 12 targets, 8 receptions, 93 receiving yards. I understand it is a concern that the Cowboys aren't going to score many points on a week-to-week basis, but like the case we were saying for Malik Neighbors all year, that volume's going to trump it. He's an elite talent. He's going to command elite volume regardless. That is how I view CeeDee Lamb moving forward. Does he have the high-end wide receiver 1 ceiling like he did with Dak? Absolutely not. But can he be a low-end wide receiver 1 getting there on volume moving forward? I absolutely view that to be the case. So when I'm looking at CeeDee Lamb, it's just trusting an elite player in a non-ideal situation right now. And then at 9 and 12 respectively, we have the Monday Night Football big-time matchup here with Ladd McConkey coming in at 9 and Zay Flowers coming in as my wide receiver 12. For reference, on this week's slate, the Ravens are projected for 26.75 road points. The Chargers at home underdogs, 24.25 projection. But the main takeaway that I have from this game is that these passing offenses could go absolutely ballistic this week. On both ends, like we'll talk about, the Chargers, the Ravens, very good at stopping the run. Both of them are far more susceptible to leaking big plays in the pass game. So starting with Ladd McConkey, he has been the clear alpha number 1 wide receiver for the Chargers. We have seen the Chargers throw the ball more out of the bye week. Herbert's playing some MVP football. And like we've mentioned with rookies across the pass, I really do think Ladd can scale up as the season goes along. This is a very advantageous matchup. We saw what Chase did. We saw what some of the biggest wide receivers in the NFL have done to this Ravens defense. And I think Ladd is next in line. Hence why I have him in my top 12, the debutant to wide receiver 1 status for him. On the flip side with Zay Flowers, he also has a very ideal matchup. Like I said, pass funnel Chargers defense, high implied over-under, nearly 27 implied points on the road this week. We love Baltimore's spot this week. And similar to Ladd McConkey, he is the alpha wide receiver 1 on this team, and he has shown elite spike week potential. I think Derrick Henry could be bottled up in this game, and I think we start to see the MVP show between Herbert, between Lamar on either side, and this is the highest scoring game of the slate, just like Vegas expects, which is why it's the number 1 over-under of the week. And then wide receiver 11 for me this week is DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks, 24.25 implied Seahawks points this week, hosting the Arizona Cardinals in that divisional matchup. He returned last week, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 70 receiving yards, and now gets a very nice game environment against the Cardinals, like we'll talk about in a second once we talk about Marvin Harrison Jr. and Jackson Smith-Njigba. But when it comes to DK Metcalf, I mean, he has a 24% seasonal target share, came back to 29% of the targets last week, and we know he has that big 20-plus point point ceiling any given week. So this is a high stakes game. I think the Seahawks are going to lean on their passing game, and this is crucial for NFC West standing moving forward. The Cardinals want to win on the other end. The Seahawks want to win on their end, and I think this is one of the best games of the weekend. But you know to start these guys, hence why they're in the wide receiver 1 discussion. So before we move on to the wide receivers 13 and 36, I want you guys to know how to get access to our weekly rankings moving forward. The weekly rankings manifesto is the #1 resource to help you guys win those fantasy championships, and there's one of 2 ways to get it right now. First way is Underdog Fantasy. If you guys use promo code FSC, sign up and first deposit at least $10. You make one play on the site, you will get access to those rankings, especially with playoffs around the corner. And the other way is by going over to flockfantasy.com. Promo code FSC will get you 30% off any site-wide package, as well as a 7-day free trial on the site. Don't miss out. Ton of value packed in that weekly rankings manifesto, the #1 resource like I mentioned. But moving on to the wide receiver 2s, we have at wide receiver 13 and 14 respectively, Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals and Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. Like I mentioned in this matchup, Arizona 23.25 implied points. Seattle implied for 24.25 in this game. So really neck and neck, 1-point spread in Seattle this week. It's going to be one of my favorite games of the weekend, like I talked about with DK. But we'll talk about specifically from Marvin Harrison Jr.'s perspective, how he could potentially scale up out of the bye. Now, if you've had Marv this year, unfortunately, it's been a trial of ups and downs. He's kind of been that volatile high-end wide receiver 3, but I really do think he finds his way following the team's bye week. I mean, I hate throwing this around. I mean, I've already talked about it on this video with Lab McConkey, but the post-bye rookie bump is a real thing. We know Marvin Harrison Jr., very talented prospect, top overall pick. And he's flashed the ability to be a high-end wide receiver. Now, I really do think there's a possibility moving forward that Marv establishes himself as that 30% target share alpha wide receiver 1 for this team, and I think that it starts this week going up against Seattle. On the flip side for Seattle, that's exactly what JSN has been in these last few weeks. I'm still not willing to fully accept that he's above DK Metcalf based off the full sample size of the year. However, I wrote off his production without DK. I said once DK's back, he's going to be relegated back to that role that we saw earlier in the year, and JSN would be more of that boom-bust wide receiver 3. But with DK Metcalf back on the field, JSN still commanded above a 30% target share and had over 20 PPR points. I really do think it's a possibility that maybe with DK out, they realize how they want to be using JSN. And now that DK's back, we start seeing JSN's usage being used like he has these last few weeks. This has the opportunity to be a very consolidated target situation. We saw Tyler Lockett really take the effects of it this week, and I think that's what we can expect moving forward. On top of that, if JSN keeps playing like he has in these last few weeks, I think he is a staple to be a top 15 wide receiver on a week-to-week basis, especially in smash game environments like he is against Arizona this week. But moving on to wide receiver 15, we have Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants hosting the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week. 17.5 implied home points for the Giants. And there is a little bit of a caveat. He is dealing apparently with a groin issue. He told reporter Jordan Renan that he should be able to suit up on Sunday. So I am going about it expecting Malik Neighbors to play. Of course, he does play at 1 p.m. If you have a pivot, make sure you do. But if he does play, I'm not expecting much limitation, considering the fact that going into week 7, he was dealing with the same groin injury and he played 93% of the snaps. But we'll talk about the overall game environment itself, because on one hand, I mean, Tampa Bay is a very pass funnel defense, second easiest matchup on the matchup chart. They are very susceptible through the pass. The problem, though, Daniel Jones with his release, Tommy DeVito being named the starter, gives me some pause for concern. How is this offense going to function with Tommy DeVito? I understand they did need change based off Daniel Jones's play, but is Tom DeVito really an upgrade? Like, is he really going to sustain this offense? Less than 18 implied points at home. I mean, they're literally throwing Cooper Rush numbers out there at quarterback. So all jokes aside, I am concerned about this offense, even despite the positive matchup. And with the level of uncertainty that I have, I did have to drop him in my rankings. I usually view him as a back-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2 at the worst. But at this point, I can't put him above guys like JSN, above guys like Marvin Harrison Jr., who do have offensive insulation that they're tethered to. But moving on to wide receiver 16, we have Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders, 27.25 implied Commander points this week at home against Dallas. And I understand from a game environment perspective, you're thinking, well, what exactly is there not to like about Terry McLaurin? High implied total, great matchup going up against what's been a susceptible Dallas defense. And we know, Jaden Daniels, Rookie of the Year, this and that. Like, I understand from a pure overall macro perspective, it looks like this is a smash spot for Terry McLaurin. But I do have some concerns. It doesn't really have to do with concerns about him struggling against Philly. Like I said, Philly has been very good against the pass as of late. Like, I understand him having a dud game. It's more so just the fact that I have concerns that with Daniels being banged up, this offense not really looking the same as of late. and not to mention Cliff's rigid use of Terry McLaurin. He plays the majority of his snaps on the left boundary, and as you guys can see with these stats tweeted by Josh Norris, founded by Rich Rebar, Dallas is extremely competent against such an alignment. And with Cliff Kingsbury, if he's not willing to adjust Terry McLaurin, get him into the slot, get him to the right side, I am concerned about him potentially being shut down. And the other factor that nobody's really talking about right now is that DaRon Bland is expected to make his season debut this week. Dallas has been a very bad run defense. They've been susceptible in the back end, but their main weakness as a defense is through the run. With Bland being back, I'm curious if teams just simply run the football against this front seven. They're beat up front. DeMarcus Lawrence is still out. They're weak at linebacker. They have the worst defensive tackles in the league. Why test DaRon Bland now when you have that front seven that you can easily take advantage of? And I do view that being the case for Washington this week. I have Brian Robinson as an RB1 in my rankings, and I have Austin Eckler as a top 24 running back in my rankings. I think the way Washington wins this week is fully on that run game. Wide receiver 17 for me this week is Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos, 23.5 implied Broncos points on the road against Vegas this week. And he's been on the tear in this last month. 8+ targets in each game, 18.5 PPR points per game in that stretch. And the only real issue that I have, the concern that I have, is that Vegas is an extreme run funnel defense. They've actually been quietly good against the pass, but they are horrific against the run. So maybe we do see, an Audric Estime / Javonte Williams game script. But with how Bo Nix has looked, with how Sutton has looked, and with the respect they're getting from Vegas, like 23.5 implied road points for a Bo Nix Denver-led offense is extremely shocking based off the expectations we have coming into the year. With how Bo Nix has been playing, with how Sutton himself has been playing, I think he has the opportunity to be a league winner down the stretch. And finally, Calvin Ridley comes in at 16.5 implied Titans points on the other side of that Tennessee versus Houston matchup. And despite having a mediocre stat line this past week, he's been commanding wide receiver 1 level volume and has played his best ball in the last month of the year. Houston is a pass funnel defense, and with Spears and Pollard banged up, Spears out of the lineup, Pollard been dealing with his own injury issues, I think there's a real possibility Tennessee leans on that passing game this week. And with Ridley, he's demonstrated a high ceiling, 220+ point performances in his last 4 games. And until he reverts back to that midseason form where despite the high usage, he just wasn't getting there because he was playing bad football, until he reverts back to that, I think we need a wide receiver 2 expectation for Ridley. But moving on to the low end wide receiver 2s, we start off at wide receiver 19 with Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts, 21.5 implied points at home this week against Detroit. And he's averaging 14.7 PPR points as the wide receiver 17 this year. And he showed this past week that average is more than capable of supporting his production. Detroit is a tough defense, but they are a pass funnel given how strong they are against the run. And Downs has proven to be an alpha level target earner for this offense. 9+ targets in 6 of his 9 games. And if Average keeps playing the way he did against the Jets, there's a real possibility Downs can also be a league winner down the stretch. Moving on to wide receivers 20, 21, and 23 respectively, we have Jawan Jennings and Deebo Samuel of the Niners, and we have Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers respectively coming in at those spots. With the Niners receivers, I do slightly favor Jawan Jennings, but both had to be downgraded with the news that Brock Purdy will be out for this game. I'm still willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, they're implied for a respectable 19.5 points. Shout out Kyle Shanahan. 19.5 implied points against Green Bay on the road shows that Vegas trusts Shanahan to at least raise the floor for this offense. And although Brandon Allen, again, I'm not going to go out here and say he is Brock Purdy, I think he can play a solid game in relief for Purdy. We know Jawan Jennings, the way he's been playing as of late. We know Deebo Samuel, the high ceiling he represents. If Brandon Allen is just able to suffice and efficiently distribute the football, I think both can get there. I think both have to be downgraded because with Brock Purdy, both would be in that, top 15, top 12 level wide receiver discussion. But even without Brock Purdy, I trust the Shanny system to get them over the top. And on the flip side for Jaden Reed, fall from grace really just stems from the lack of comparable usage as of late compared to what he was seeing earlier in the year. I am, of course, willing to give him the benefit of the doubt as well. He is playing with Matt LaFleur. He is playing with Jordan Love. He does have that big play week winning level ceiling, but I am starting to get concerned for Jaden Reed. Is he more of that volatile week-to-week projection, or can he establish himself back into those wide receiver 1 graces like he was earlier in the year? I don't know what exactly has been the case for Jaden Reed, but ultimately, I think he has too high of a ceiling and too good of an offense to drop lower than this. Wide receiver 22 is Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and this is one I really struggled where to place on this list because on one hand, 23.5 implied points on the road against the Giants. I mean, if we knew he would play a 85 plus, 90 plus % snap share, Mike Evans would be a top 8 to 10 wide receiver in my rankings this week. But the level of concern that I have in terms of his overall usage, does he play 40% of the snaps? Does he play 50% of the snaps? Does he play 65% of the snaps? Causes him to be more of a low-end wide receiver 2 projection for me. Again, it's a very similar case to what we saw from Nico Collins, where the team's singing the drum beat, he's fully healthy, and then he goes out there and plays 47% of the snaps on Monday Night Football. I think that's a cause of concern for Mike Evans. Again, do I still think when he does play, he's going to be on the field for consequential, valuable snaps? Absolutely, but at the same time, there's a big difference in his projection if he's playing 80% of the snaps versus if he's playing 55% of the snaps this week. But moving on to wide receiver 24 for me this week is DeAndre Hopkins going up against Carolina. 27 implied chase points this week. There is more concern now with Xavier Worthy playing a really big game this past week that he can threaten more opportunity from DeAndre Hopkins. But I look at it on the other side. If it's strengthening the Chiefs' offense, if it's giving Patrick Mahomes a more vertical threat, I think it opens up a lot more underneath for DeAndre Hopkins. We know what him and Kelce can do from a volume standpoint. Having Worthy be able to stretch the field may very well be the benefit that we can expect. However, Carolina is a run funnel defense, but Hopkins has shown a legit wide receiver 1 ceiling like he did against Tampa Bay. So kind of, mixing both, because on one hand, I think he's got a top 12 level weekly ceiling. But on the other hand, with Worthy's emergence, with the run funnel matchup, he lands here at 24. But moving on to wide receiver 25 for me this week, we have Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. And he has been very up and down across the full year, but we have seen with Diggs out of the lineup, 25 plus targets in his last 3 games. And with Nico Collins coming back, I really expect this Texans offense to vault moving forward. Dell has commanded 22 plus % of the targets in every game since Diggs has been out. I think it's a matter of when, not if, we see CJ Stroud get back to his top level of play. But moving on to wide receiver 26 for me this week is Quentin Johnson of the LA Chargers. I already mentioned the game environment when I talked about Zay and Ladd McConkey, but I do have to give Quentin Johnson his flowers. In games he has played over 50% of the snaps this year, he is averaging 12.7 PPR points per game. And like I talked about with Ladd, pass funnel Ravens defense, big play upside that Quentin Johnson represents. And with how Justin Herbert has been playing, I think Quentin Johnson has the opportunity, like a Jameson Williams, like an Xavier Worthy, to make some big plays down the field in this pass funnel matchup. Speaking of Jameson Williams, he comes here next at 27. And like I mentioned with the Monner, 29 implied points for the Lions this week. And I understand if you do have Jameson Williams, he's an extremely volatile projection on a week-to-week basis, but he does have a huge ceiling, like we have seen evidence, being able to work down the field, being able to work that 4.2 speed. So I understand his low target share does make him a concern, but with how good this Lions offense looks, he is worthwhile as a top 30 play on a week-to-week basis. Sometimes you're going to get left holding the bag, but sometimes, like last week, you profit a big time. But next up at wide receivers 28 and 29, I have Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears, and I have DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, both obviously playing against the Minnesota Vikings at home this week. But I do think the order is the important part of this, because I do actually have Rome Odunze ranked higher than DJ Moore. Well, as we can see right here, Rome Odunze has higher targets per out run, higher target share, air yards, end zone targets, 3rd and 4th down targets, and ultimately more PPR points per game since the team's bye week. I think both these guys can scale up with Thomas Brown taking over play calling duties, and with how Caleb Williams really looked comfortable in his first start with Thomas Brown. So for me, I think the Bears offense is going to keep scaling. Don't really look at those PPR points per game. Just more so look at how the receivers are being used. And for me personally, with how Rome Odunze has looked, and with him being a rookie and potentially scaling up, like I've mentioned all video, I do prefer him of the Bears receivers moving forward. And at 30, we have Jacoby Myers of the Vegas Raiders, 17.5 implied Raiders points this week. And this is a very difficult matchup going up against Denver, but Myers is a top 2 target on this offense. And with Madison and Zamir White expected to be out for this game, I think they lean on a pass-happy game plan, considering that is the strength of their main RB1 now with Amir Abdullah. Myers has been that consistent high-volume target for them all year and has been a top 30 wide receiver in points per game. And specifically since week 3, he is the wide receiver 17 in PPR points per game. So I do have to downgrade him because of the matchup going up against Pat Surtain, but I do think he's a far cleaner volume projection than any of these guys in the flex play tier and beyond. But moving on to my wide receivers 31 and 33, they actually both played on Thursday Night Football. Cedric Tillman of the Browns and Jerry Jeudy of the Browns. Now, unfortunately for Cedric Tillman, his day got cut short with a concussion he suffered against Pittsburgh. Before that, only 4 targets, 2 receptions, 28 receiving yards. Hopefully, he is fully able to recover from that concussion suffered. On the flip side, though, with Jerry Jeudy, very, very efficient game. He's been on a tear as of late. 6 targets, 6 receptions, 85 receiving yards. With Cedric Tillman now potentially out of the lineup and with how much the Browns have been throwing, I really do think Jerry Jeudy has a case to be a consistent wide receiver 3 moving forward. And in fact, in the last month, he's been a wide receiver 2 in fantasy. Wide receiver 32 is Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. And I already talked about Hopkins. But like I mentioned with Xavier Worthy, that 4.2 speed, that connection he's starting to now build with Patrick Mahomes has really come onto display this past week. The 2 weeks prior, man, like he really just, I don't know if it was a mental game. I don't know what was going on, but he was getting looks down the field. He was getting targeted by Patrick Mahomes, but he simply was not able to come down with those plays. We saw him coming down with those plays this past week. If that's the Xavier Worthy we're going to get moving forward, I think he can establish as a high-end wide receiver 3 or maybe higher, being tethered to Patrick Mahomes. We'll kind of see how he develops because he is a rookie. He was raw coming in terms of the physicality nature of the NFL game, but I really do have high hopes for Xavier Worthy. I liked him as a prospect. I love, of course, the speed dynamic he brings to this team. Hopkins can't really run at this point. Travis Kelce can't really run. They needed a player that can affect that third level. But on the flip side of that matchup, we actually have the other Xavier in this game with Xavier Legette, the other first-round wide receiver Xavier, going on the other side for Carolina, and he's played some very good ball as of late. He's now finally a full-time player, 90+% of the routes in each of the last 2 games, and I understand it is a very difficult matchup. The Chiefs' defense has been absolutely elite this year, but I just love the profile Legette brings to the table. Is he the most consistent projection on a week-to-week basis? Absolutely not. But you can't teach the size, you can't teach the speed, and you can't teach this young Panthers team potentially developing as the season goes along. Xavier Legette, that former first-round pick, being the main beneficiary of that. 35, we have Wan'Dale Robinson, the almost anti-Xavier Worthy Xavier Legette projection of the New York Giants this week. And like I mentioned with Malik Neighbors, I do have concerns. How is this offense going to function with Tommy DeVito? Is Wan'Dale Robinson still going to be that PPR scam he's been all year? 7 out of 10 games with 8+ targets? We're going to see more of a schematic change to build around Tommy DeVito. That is my main question that I have. He was a big-time player with Daniel Jones in the lineup, but how exactly does that dynamic change with Tommy DeVito? However, it's still a very good matchup. It's still a very pass-funnel defense, so I will trust Wan'Dale Robinson until Tommy DeVito proves it otherwise. Then finally at 36, we have Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers, who has not been on this top 36 list in a while. Of course, going up against San Francisco this week. We saw Christian Watson on display this past week. 4 receptions, 150 yards, working that big play nature down the field. And he is volatile, but I mean, we've kind of made this case for how many 5, 6 players of the last 10 I've talked about. They're all volatile projections in this range. But because he's tethered to Jordan Love, because he's tethered to this 24 implied point Green Bay offense, you have to put Christian Watson in your lineup once you get past the top 35. He has too high of a ceiling with the size, with the speed that he brings to the table, to impact matchups to be left on the bench. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. Like I mentioned in the middle of the video, if you guys want access to our weekly rankings manifesto, there's one of 2 ways to access it right now. First way, Underdog Fantasy. If you guys sign up and first deposit at least $10, one play on the site will get you access to our weekly rankings moving forward. The other way, flockfantasy.com. Promo code FSC will get you 30% off any site-wide package, as well as a 7-day free trial on the site. But with that being said, good luck in your matchups. Comment your start sits down below. I'll try to get to as many as possible. Let's try to get those dubs, baby. Let's try to get those playoff spots secured.